We live in a world that lacks courage. Would you agree? If you were to think for a moment what difference it would make if courage were in abundant supply, if people all over the world were people of courage, how would current events, for instance, be different? What would the news look like? How would it change from one day to the next? What would the news cycle have instead of what it currently has if we were a race of courageous people? I wonder. This morning I'd like us to take a look at a topic that the world sorely needs to know more about. It starts in the book of Joshua. If you have a Bible, take a look please at Joshua chapter 1. Beginning with verse 1, and we're going to read up through verse 6. Joshua chapter 1, it's on page 151 in your blue Bible in the back of the pew in front of you there. Page 151, Joshua chapter 1. Courage is a topic that often we command, but little do we study. And today I want us to fix that. In the story that we're going to read, we find the story of a very courageous man who didn't start that way. We're going to read a story here about Joshua, just a little snippet from his life. To get the scene here, the children of Israel have been wandering around in the desert for a very long time, and now it is time for Joshua to take over because Moses has died. Joshua's second in line. It's time for him to take the reins, and this is what happens. Joshua chapter 1, beginning verse 1, it says, After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, quote, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the great sea on the west. That would be the Mediterranean. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And then comes the beginning of one of the most famous passages in all of the Old Testament. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and be courageous. In just these few short verses, I think there are at least two lessons that we can learn about true courage. Lesson number 1, true courage never depends on that which is dead. True courage never depends on that which is dead. Now, let's be honest here. If God had been enrolled in a pastoral care course at a university, he would have flunked in this chapter. You got to picture the scene here because Moses has died. Moses, considered at that time and even to this day, by at least religious Jews, to be the greatest leader that the world has ever known. Moses, the one that was there at the parting of the Red Sea. Moses, who brought water from a rock. Moses, who led this vast multitude of people through the desert decade after decade after decade. And he has died. And now the second in command. I mean, does the word pressure apply here? I don't know. You're Joshua. Standing, if you have a little bit of a track record, you've done a few things, but it's always been in the shadow of the big M. Moses was this overshadowing, dominant figure, and now he is dead. And the first thing God says when he shows up to comfort Joshua, Moses is dead. It's not what they taught me to say when I go to somebody's house who's grieving. And yet this is exactly what God does. There's no preamble. There's no arm around the shoulder. It's going to be all right. Things are going to be okay. We're going to work this out. Let's talk about it. Moses, my servant, is dead. Why does God do it? Now remember last week, we learned an important principle. When God does something, particularly in the Old Testament, when God seems to do something unreasonable, a good rule of thumb is to ask the question, well, what would have happened if God had not done that? What would have happened if God had approached Joshua differently? What would have happened if God had not started out by saying, Moses, my servant, is dead? Well, I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet, but in my mind's eye, the best I can tell, here's what I think would have happened. Joshua would have gone before the people, his first big assembly. Everybody is there, all these thousands and thousands of people. And he would have said, in essence, well, I think Moses would have done thus and such. What would Moses do in this situation? Well, I think that Moses would do. And God knew that if Joshua was going to be successful, that there needed to be a source of courage that didn't rely on somebody who was not. It had to rely on the same source that Moses had relied upon, God himself. And we look at that from our distance of thousands of years later, and it's pretty easy to nod our heads and say, okay, I get it. But let me ask you, how often do we rely on dead things as our source of courage? Class reunions. When we go to a class reunion, what is our source of courage? We look good, we sound good, we drive the right car, we live in the right place, and we have the right profession next to our name. It happens all the time. The rest of the world tends to live this way too. When we feel insecure, what do? Well, maybe we reach for our wallet if there happens to be something in it, right? Maybe we reach for our prestige, our reputation, our education. We look at these things and we lean on these dead things as our source of courage. We depend upon them. And by day we may look good, but at night we're biting our nails terribly. And we don't have any true courage. It's just a mirage. It's like relying on that which is dead. So God starts off with an absolute right foot, in my opinion. Joshua, let me tell you, you want to be successful? You've got all these people here. There's a vast territory here for you to take. The promised land's been promised to your people in there. You're the guy, not Moses, so let's get it straight from the very beginning. Don't depend on someone that is dead. Depend on me, the living God. I can give you all that you need. Which brings us to the second lesson about true courage. True courage always starts with meeting God. True courage always starts with meeting God. I'm not talking about the feeling of, I feel courageous today. In fact, to be honest, some of the most courageous people in history did not feel that way when they were being so courageous. This is not a feeling. It's not something manufactured here. True courage, the real thing that God gives, it always starts with a meeting with God. You know, God could have sent a letter. God was good with letters. We got a whole book here full of letters, right? God could have sent him somebody, another messenger, another prophet could have gone to Joshua. And God says, Joshua, be strong, be courageous. God himself shows up because that's where courage comes from. Courage comes from meeting God. In fact, maybe I could put it to you this way. If you are not meeting with God, where are you planning on getting your courage from? If you are not meeting with God, to know him, to engage with him, to have that closeness. You know, Jesus says, John 17, verse 3, and this is eternal life, that they may know you, the one true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. That sounds like meeting to me. Meeting with God. If you are not meeting with God on a regular basis, where are you hoping your courage will come from? I want to suggest to you there's only one other option. It's the dead things that God has already told Joshua, don't depend on that. True courage always starts with meeting God. It reminds me of a story. Many years ago, I'm guessing this is the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, somewhere in that range. There was a church in Chicago, Presbyterian church. I do not know if it is still in existence today. I'm guessing it is, but I do not know. At that time, it was a grand, this Gothic structure, and was one of the most popular churches in Chicago. And a man who was a little boy at that time, his name was Bruce Larson. He tells the story of how he loved to go to this Presbyterian church. And he said, the preaching was inspirational, the singing was incredible, ringing through the high ceilings there in the main meeting hall. It was an incredible place, but those were not the favorite parts of the service for this young boy. Now, I must confess, it's a little hard on my preacher's ego to learn what his favorite thing was. But here was his favorite thing in the service. His favorite thing in that service was when the 12 deacons would come down the center aisle with the offering plates in their hands. They were solemn, lockstep, very uniform in what they were doing, very, 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 very serious about the work of God they were performing there. And when these 12 deacons would come down at each worship service, it was the most impressive thing that this young boy had seen. You say, well, how come? The reason was not because of the shiny plates or the uniforms that they had on. No, it was who was among those 12 deacons. How many of you recognize the name Frank Loesch? Does that ring a bell with anybody? It's not the name that rolls off of the name of most people's lips. Frank Loesch was one of those deacons. And at the time this young boy saw him, he must have been in his 70s, perhaps even in his 80s by then. Frank Loesch was not much to look at physically, but he was a living legend in Chicago. We do not know much about the early life of Frank Loesch, according to the story, but we do know this. Frank Loesch had met God, and it radically changed his life. He was never the same again. And he became part of God's work, but that was not so simple at first. In fact, in the early years of his life, when he was getting late teens and his 20s, he wasn't quite sure what God wanted him to do. And so he entered law, trained as an attorney. He didn't much care for representing criminals in court, and so he said, well, I'm going to kind of do corporate law. He ended up working for the city of Chicago. And it was there, I'm sure unplanned by the city council, that he found his niche, because the city council was corrupt. And in a deal with a railroad company, I don't know the specifics of the deal, but he said later on, Frank Loesch said later on, all of the requests from the city council amounted to extortion. They were pulling strings, they were twisting arms to get a good deal, to get more money for them, less money for the railroads, etc., etc. And Frank Loesch launched off on 6 decades of working against organized crime. Now you got to picture this. I mean, this is again a diminutive guy, not physically impressive, but oh, what an attorney God had at his disposal, and he took on some of the worst criminals of the day, maybe even in modern history. In 1919, he started something called the Chicago Crime Commission, which, by the way, still is in existence today. He was one of the founders of it. He later on became its president. And the commission was kind of this interesting in-between place. You see, in Chicago at that time, many of the politicians and city governance were corrupt. The mob was huge. The Italian mob there was running all kinds of money laundering things. This was during Prohibition, so producing alcohol, etc. And this ill-fated marriage between government and organized crime. And Frank Loesch is thinking to himself, this has got to stop. People are dying in the streets. Murders taking place, money being taken from people that these mob people don't deserve to have what they're having. How can I stop it? So he said, let's put something in the middle. Let's go to the public. You familiar with the phrase public enemy number one? That's Frank Loesch. He created that. FBI's 10 most wanted list, he didn't start it with the FBI, but that crime commission was the first one to list publicly, in order, the criminals that were the worst. That's where the FBI got it from. But even though the public was being educated, he still was not able to take down one of the biggest kingpins. His name was Al Capone. Al Capone, just in case you don't know, was a mobster. He was a nasty man. He killed a lot of people. He made a lot of money. And he was very much together with city governance. In fact, one of the mayors of Chicago was one of his best friends. That's how he managed to work so long. And gradually, Frank Loesch, as an attorney and a group of attorneys, they began to whittle away at Capone's empire, taking this little guy here, taking a front man here, but not able to get to Al Capone. Finally, there came what they call, I believe, was the Valentine's Day Massacre. It was at an election, and things were just getting out of hand. And Frank Loesch, did probably one of the most dangerous things that anybody had done in Chicago for a very long time. He said to himself, I haven't yet been able to indict Al Capone, so I'm going to go see him. As soon as the commission had been started, death threats had been coming to Frank Loesche and to his family and to his friends. And he still said, there are too many people dying. I'm going to go see the man himself. And so he walks up and essentially knocks on his hotel room door. Capone lets him in. Frank sits across the table and says, you need to stop this. We got another election coming up. It needs to be free. People need to come to the polls just freely as possible. And to everyone's surprise, for that matter, Loesche said later, including his, Capone said, okay. It was one of the cleanest elections that Chicago had seen for generations. But it was temporary. Capone continued to do his thing, and gradually Frank Loesche and his team finally began to hone in, and ultimately Capone was successfully indicted. And those of you who know, he did go to prison. He served for, 10 years, something like that, and ultimately died of some of the, shall we say, diseases he had picked up in his nefarious activities. But before that happened, when he was indicted, let me just read to you from the Chicago Tribune. December 18, 2011, they were doing a retrospective on Chicago's history, and here's what they said. They said, when, quote, the feds indicted Capone in October of 1931, the very next month, Frank Loesche, now 79 years old, heard 3 knocks at his door. Slipped under it was a note that read, one false move and you die. The note was signed, The Black Spot. Sounds fairly ominous. The Tribune reported Loesche's response on page 1, front page. Quote, I can't understand it, he said. I'm not interested in any important case now. And then he says this. Listen carefully. Moreover, I can't be scared. They must be joking. Small wonder that at nearly every service that Bruce Larson attended at that Presbyterian church years later, nearly every time his father, when those deacons came down the aisle, would point to Frank Loesche with tremendous admiration. At times there were even tears, Bruce remembers, in his father's eyes. Because here was a man who had managed to do something that so few people seemed to do. He had courageously lived out his faith in public life. What a treasure he was, and an inspiration to all who saw him. Mr. Loesche had met God, and he came away with courage. Let me ask you, what is it this morning that you are afraid of? What this morning scares you? What this morning is holding you back because you are afraid? I want to challenge you to name that fear and do what Joshua did and what Frank Loesche did and what so many thousands of saints through the years have done, and exchange your fears for God's courage. Take what it is that you are afraid of. Go to him in prayer. Name it and say, God, by your grace, I ask for your courage. Give me your courage, Lord. And in your mind, face whatever it is that you are afraid of. Be it in a moment or over a period of time, God will bring courage to your heart. It is your birthright as a Christian. If you are a son or daughter of God, what does the Bible say? God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. That sounds like courage to me, doesn't it? If you are a son or daughter of Jesus Christ, you are not called to live a fearful life in the shadows. Bring your fears to him. Give them to him. Face them. Ask for his courage. He will grant it, because all true courage begins with Jesus Christ. The third and final lesson from this brief passage here. Joshua chapter 1. Start at verse 6 here. We'll read that one again and then keep going. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Lesson number 3 about true courage is that true courage is magnified by obedience. True courage is magnified by obedience. Now, let's be honest here. Verse 7 through verse 8 generally are excluded when this text is quoted. Verses 7 through 8 don't make for very good bumper stickers. You can see Christians, be strong and courageous. Have I not commanded you? Do not be afraid. Do not be terrified. For the Lord God is with you wherever you go. We like that part. But then it's almost like somebody, was having a bad day, and so they interpolated something here. They put this in the text because surely, with all of this pep talk, because remember the scene, it's Joshua before his first big thing with the Israelites without Moses. Why doesn't he just stop with the be strong and courageous part? Instead, he goes into this, and it's not just a momentary thing. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey. He doesn't stop there. He says, all the law my servant Moses gave you, don't turn from the right or the left. Do not let the book of the law depart from you. Meditate on it day and night. I mean, this is almost an obsession. God is saying to Joshua, if you want to be successful, really successful, and my guess is if Joshua could look over his shoulder, maybe look out the door of his tent and see these thousands and thousands of people that he is now supposed to take care of. I'm thinking that he's probably thinking to himself, I would like to be successful. Yes, I would like to be successful. And so God said, okay, you could be successful, but if you really want to be successful, obey what I've asked you to do. Obey what I've asked you to do. You see, in essence, what God is saying is that it's like obedience is like a magnifying glass is to the sun. Now, ladies, you are all far too civilized to have ever done this. But gentlemen, you probably remember the first time you got a magnifying glass and it was a sunny day and there were ants on the sidewalk. That's true, isn't it? Yes, right? Nodding heads, yep, been there. The ant population is significantly reduced because of the people sitting here this morning, okay? And the idea was simple, the sun would be shining there. You get your magnifying glass, and the sun by itself is just making things warm. But with the magnifying glass, it's like it focuses all of that energy, and impressive things can take place. Okay. Maybe you can get a stick of wood. With a magnifying glass, you can write your name on there. You can focus all of that energy, like this little laser beam right there. You can burn through leaves. You can light firecrackers. I better stop. I'm giving ideas to people that shouldn't have any. Okay. But it's amazing what can happen when you use a magnifying glass in the sun. And in essence, God is saying this is what obedience is to courage. You see, there have been, personal opinion, many a courageous person that has made a mess of things rather than a positive difference for the Lord. Because they came and they got their courage and then off they went on their own. When what God was really looking for is that somebody who would joyfully follow the kingdom way of life and share it with the world. And we were talking about this in my Sabbath school class this morning. God's law before Jesus is a noose around your neck. God's law with Jesus is candy for the soul. Oh, how sweet it is. We do not have to keep God's law once we have been saved. We have the privilege of keeping it. And we will keep it by His grace. It'll be our greatest desire to follow in the ways of the Lord, not to be saved, but because we have been saved. You remember the saying, do you not? Good works are the fruit, not the root of salvation. We are not saved because we do good things, but when we are saved, we will do good things, because it is our joy and privilege to do so. And by God's grace, we will seek to do what we will follow God's law. And instead of complaining about it to the universe, Lord, how dare you tell me that, greater success will come if I obey you. On 81, Interstate 81 out here, You know, people going down, they see these guardrails on the side. My guess is nobody yet has called the governor's office and say, how dare you put these guardrails on 81? I can't see the grass on that side of the road. You're ruining the view. It looks like we're in some, cave. Nobody says that because the guardrails are there for our protection. The guardrails have made many a trip that was merely difficult into something that was survivable when an accident took place. The guardrails are there to help us, to make the journey better. God's law functions in much the same way. And he's saying here that if you will seek to obey me with all your heart, follow me completely, heart, soul, and mind, you won't just be a little bit successful, but when I call you to do something and you obey, wow, sky's the limit. In fact, let me tell you one of the great stories from Adventist history. It's incredible stuff. In fact, I want to make sure that I get some of these statistics correct here. So I'm going to read a little portion here. In the 1930s, the Adventist Church in this country was trying to figure out if it was worth the risk to invest in a brand new medium of communication. It was called radio. And radio had been around for quite some time, but the idea with a mass market, where you could use it to reach large numbers of people, that was a fairly fresh thing. There were people that were doing it, but the problem was, as with so many new technologies, it was expensive. So the leaders in our church thought, well, okay, let's do a little survey. Let's do some research. Is there anybody in the Adventist church using radio right now? Maybe we can learn from them. And sure enough, they discovered there were a handful of guys doing presentations on the radio, but not very many. And when they got right down to brass tacks, what would it cost for 30 minutes nationwide, one time a week? The answer came back like the most leaden of lead balloons. $200,000. Now, that's a lot of money today. It was a ton of money back in those days. And remember, this is the 1920s and 30s, which was the Great Depression, hardly prime fundraising season, okay? $200,000. You might as well have said, well, if you can bring the moon down here, you can have a national radio broadcast. And so they began, they talked about it for a little while and said, you know what, we just can't do this, except for one guy. One guy who had met God and had heard God's call and command to go ye therefore and preach and teach to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. One man who had met God and had read the three angels' messages of Revelation 14, where there's this worldwide movement, taking the gospel in the last day, this end-time context to all of the world. He had heard those commands and was convinced. He didn't know how it was going to get done, but it sure wasn't getting done with what they were doing right now. And so when he got wind of what was happening with this radio discussion and that it had fallen flat on its face, he said to himself, no. We must obey God rather than money. And so this man, whose name was HMS Richards Sr., decided that he would obey the Great Commission and that radio was the way to do it. Now, the little problem, of course, was he had no money. And so he was doing an evangelistic series at the time. He was an evangelist. And so he went to the evangelistic series that night, and he told the people at the end, he said, the things you've been hearing, you've been in Christian. Yes, amen, brother. If you would like other people to have a chance to hear what you are hearing via radio, he said, my left-hand suit pocket at the door tonight, you can put in there whatever donation you would like to put it, and all of it will go straight towards building a fund to be on the radio. And he literally said this. He said, you can put in jewelry, you can put in cash, you can put in gold teeth. Okay? We'll take it down to the pawn shop. We'll get rid of this stuff. You put it in my left-hand pocket, and we'll do it. That night, he got $220. Now, that's sizable. This is the Depression era, okay? He got $220. He began to do this. Over the next 7 years, that radio pocket, thousands of dollars came in, and it enabled the production of a broadcast entitled The Tabernacle of the Air on KGER in Long Beach, California. Now, this was a start. But HMS said, you know what, God didn't just say, go to Long Beach. He said, go to the world. So how are we going to do that? Well, I need some more money here. And so he began to make appeals for more money, and the leadership said, there's no way you're going to get money for this. And HMS said, well, but we need to obey, and God will provide the way. And so money began to come in to the point where actually HMS in Long Beach was able to sometimes be on the air 3 times a day. I mean, this is blowing people's mind, but it was just the beginning. A few years later, HMS Richards heard of the Lone Star Four, a quartet of Adventist male nurses. They were really, really good. And HMS had already pioneered something. To us, it doesn't sound pioneering, but you got to understand, this 1920s and 30s, this was cutting-edge stuff. Most of what was on the radio was kind of very flat, almost academic sounding, very formal and stuffy. And HMS said, you know what, let's put a little music in the brew, and I'm just going to sit there behind the radio microphone and kind of conversationally share from the Bible. It was amazing. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. And so when the music component came up here, and he hears about the Lone Star Four, he said, why don't you guys come and work for me? Let's try it for 6 months. And they said, well, great. What are you going to pay us? And he said, I don't know. I don't have any money. And finally, after talking to some people at the local conference there, said, well, for 6 months, we'll pick up their salary. And so they went on the air. They were later called, anybody know? The King's Heralds, and became known and effective ministers for Christ nationally and internationally. Soon, in part on the coattails there of the King's Heralds, he renamed the broadcast, HMS renamed the broadcast, and he called it The Voice of Prophecy. His program was picked up by 7 stations up and down the West Coast, and finally, one of the local unions there in California decided, okay, this seems to be working, maybe something might be happening here, let's put a little money towards this. And HMS says, hold on. If we really want to prove the effectiveness of radio to potential donors in the church here, let's do an evangelistic series that is publicized purely by radio. And let's do it in Lodi, California. Now, no offense to those of you listening online that live in Lodi, California. We're glad that you're here. You may not know this, but Lodi is not actually the center of the civilized world, okay? It may not be the most auspicious place to test this new medium, right? But HMS was thinking, we're going to obey what God has asked us to do. And so they advertised this on the radio. Long story short, the results were astonishing. 280 people were baptized as a result of that series in Lodi, California. 280 people. By 1941, the Voice of Prophecy broadcast went nationwide. A guy by the name of Fortis Dedamore. Now, if you're less than 50 years old, that probably doesn't ring any bells. Fortis Dedamore was the dean of Adventist evangelists for many years. In fact, to this day, the material that you'll hear, a Mark Finley, a Doug Baxter, or an evangelist use, much of it will trace its roots back to the methods of presentation that Fortis Dedamore did. Well, he heard what was happening with HMS on the radio, and he said, I'll tell you what, let's do a Bible school. People can call in, we'll give a number on the air, they can call in, they can get materials, we'll do a Bible school next to this. And this time, HMS was skeptical. So, come on, the Lord is blessed, but I mean, people really going to call in to a radio show to get stuff in the mail? I mean, how's this going to work? In the first month, 2,000 people enrolled. 2,000 people. Soon a Spanish broadcast was added. Dr. Perez Marcio spearheaded the effort. 225 stations were now broadcasting the Voice of Prophecy, including places like Panama and Ecuador. By the mid-1940s, the minister was being aired over shortwave radio in Australia and Africa. By 1946, more than 600 stations carried the broadcast, and more than 70,000 families contacted the Voice of Prophecy asking about the Bible study school. 70,000. Radio Luxembourg, Europe's most powerful station at the time, began broadcasting Voice of Prophecy in 1947 in 6 different languages, while 450 newspapers were carrying VOP's Bible Questions and Answers column. In the late 40s and the 1950s, Voice of Prophecy began to be broadcast on ABC and NBC stations in the States. And overseas, what was happening here was simply dwarfed. The ministry exploded. The format of a conversational style, the King's Herald, now joined by a young lady by the name of Del Delker. Some of you may remember her name. And solid Bible truth. It was used with great effect. In Japan alone, 100,000 students enrolled in the Voice of Prophecy Bible School during the first 5 years. 100,000 of them. Outreach to Muslims soon followed in Cairo, Beirut, and Tehran. In 1971, The Voice of Prophecy broadcast made a strong push in shortwave radio transmission, and the response was phenomenal. Sometimes 1,000 listeners each month would contact VOP through the broadcast done in Asia, Australia, and Africa, Sri Lanka, and Macau. The ministry would soon become known, this is the extra branch here, as AWR, which stands for Adventist World Radio. Today, Adventist World Radio reaches millions of people all over the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ, many of them in closed countries that we cannot have missionaries. One other highlight to mention. Part of the growing radio outreach that Richards was doing spawned other ideas amongst other members. There was a group of church members near Emmanuel Missionary College, which today is known as Andrews University. They decided they wanted to dramatize Bible stories and present them on the air. By 1976, there was a program called, anybody know? Your Story Hour. Your Story Hour. It was aired over 550 radio stations from the get-go because someone had been encouraged by what was happening with HMS, and they donated $750,000 worth of free airtime. In North America, Africa, Australia, the Caribbean, and the Philippines, hundreds of thousands of children heard the good news about Jesus Christ through Your Story Hour. HMS Richards Sr., the Voice of Prophecy broadcast, Adventist World Radio, Your Story Hour, and countless other radio ministries enabled the gospel, the three angels' messages, to go to the world in a way that could not have been dreamt of previously. Millions of people have been reached. Thousands and thousands have been baptized. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been changed for eternity. And it can all be traced back to someone who met Jesus Christ and has received his gift of courage and said, I will obey your call to go to the world. I don't know how, I don't see how, but you have said go, and I will go. And the results have been what can rightly be considered the most successful ministry endeavor in the history of the world. Because you see, that's what happens when people come to Jesus and they are willing to sacrifice and obey, and their courage is magnified beyond what they ever could have done before. What is it that you are afraid of? What is it that stops you from doing what you know the Lord would have you to do? Is there known sin in your life? I'm not talking about the stuff that, sneaking around there. I'm talking, is there something that you're cherishing that you know you shouldn't be? And yet God's call is still to you. I can use you. I can do great things through you in there. Don't wait another day. Bring your fears, bring your sin to Him. Give them to Him. Let Him take them away. God is looking for people in these last days that will be willing to stand courageously for Him. Now is not the time for limp-wristed Christianity. Now is not the time for Adventists to be hiding their light under so many bushels. Now is not the time to be leaning on things that cannot support it. Now is the time to come to Jesus Christ, to come to Him, to ask for His gift of courage. And so I plead with you. I plead with you. I believe that Jesus Christ is coming soon. I would love for it to be even sooner. But I know that that will not happen as long as we have a job to do and we are not willing to do it. So, whatever it is that holds you back, whatever it is that you're afraid of, don't let another day go by. Bring it to Jesus. Place it in His hands. Let Him replace your cowardice with His courage. And then stand back and do whatever it is He's asked you to do. Wouldn't it be awesome if we could look back on this Sabbath someday in heaven and say, praise the Lord, that was the day that it all began. Father in heaven, our natural tendency is to be afraid. Ever since the fruit was eaten, Lord, something happened deep within the human psyche, and we naturally gravitate to fear. So, Lord, I pray that we would be unnatural, that we would be people that lean on You as the ultimate source of courage, a never-ending supply, Lord. I pray that we would no longer be people that feel we need to cower in the shadows, but that we would instead, with all Your love and power and grace and mercy stand courageously for you. May we be strong and courageous because you are with us. We pray this in your name. Amen.